I never used to believe in any of this. Ghosts, bad energy, houses that remember things. I was the guy who rolled his eyes at every campfire story. But what happened to me over 6 weeks in the fall of 2019 changed that, and I still don't have a clean explanation for it, even now. I'm only writing this down because I think saying it out loud, finally, might help me sleep through a full night again. It started with a good deal. I had just gotten a remote contracting job and wanted out of my cramped apartment in the city, so I started looking at rentals further out, in small towns where the money would stretch further. That's how I found the listing for a farmhouse on Mill Creek Road, just outside a town so small it didn't even have a stoplight. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, 12 acres of land, and rent that was less than half of what I'd been paying for a 1-bedroom box downtown. The listing photos showed a slightly tired but charming old house, white paint peeling in places, a red barn leaning gently in the back field. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Holt, met me there in person. He was polite but quiet, the kind of quiet that I mistook at the time for simple small-town reserve. He told me the house had been in his family for generations, that the last tenants had only stayed a few months before moving on for work reasons. I didn't think to ask him what kind of work. I signed the lease that same week. The first 2 weeks were genuinely peaceful. I'd wake up to actual silence, no traffic, no sirens, just birds and wind moving through the tall grass. I started taking my coffee out onto the porch every morning, watching the mist roll off the creek at the edge of the property. I remember thinking I'd finally made a smart decision with my life. That feeling didn't last. The first strange thing was small enough that I brushed it off. I kept hearing footsteps on the second floor, slow and deliberate, always at night, always when I was alone downstairs. The house was old, and old houses settle and creak, so I told myself that's all it was. But settling doesn't sound like someone walking the length of a hallway and then pausing, like they're listening for something. After about the 4th night of this, I went up there with a flashlight, heart hammering in a way I told myself was silly. The hallway was empty, of course, but the air up there was noticeably colder than the rest of the house, even though I hadn't touched the thermostat. Around the 3rd week, things shifted from unsettling to genuinely frightening. I started losing time. I don't mean I lost track of an afternoon scrolling on my phone. I mean I would sit down at my desk at 10 in the morning to start working, and the next thing I was aware of, it would be 4 in the afternoon, with no memory of the hours in between, and my work completely untouched, as if I'd never sat down at all. The first time it happened, I assumed I'd fallen asleep. The second time, I started keeping a notebook next to my laptop, jotting down the time every time I looked up. There's a page in that notebook where the times just stop mid-morning and pick back up again hours later in noticeably shakier handwriting that I don't fully remember writing. I called my sister during that stretch, mostly just to hear a normal voice. I didn't tell her about the missing time because saying it out loud felt insane. Instead, I mentioned the footsteps, joking about it, the way you do when you want someone to either reassure you or take you seriously without you having to ask directly. She got quiet for a second and then said something that I haven't been able to shake since. She asked if the house was on Mill Creek Road. I hadn't told her the address. When I asked how she knew, she said, "Our mother used to clean houses out that way decades ago, back before either of us were born, and there was one on that road she refused to go back into after her second visit." My sister didn't remember the details, only that our mother described it as a house that didn't like being lived in alone. I should have left then. I think some part of me knew that, but I'd just signed a year lease. I'd already told my new employer I was settled and reachable at this address, and pride is a strange, stupid thing that keeps people in bad situations longer than it should. So I stayed, and I started paying closer attention, which in hindsight might have been the worst decision. The basement door was something I'd avoided from day one, not out of fear, just because there was nothing down there I needed. It was an old, low-ceilinged dirt floor basement, the kind with a single bulb on a pull string and shelves of mason jars nobody had touched in years. One night in early October, I heard something down there. Not footsteps this time, scraping, slow and rhythmic, like furniture being dragged a few inches, stopping, then dragging again. I stood at the top of those stairs for a long time before I made myself go down. The shelves had been moved. Not knocked over. Moved deliberately, exposing a section of the dirt floor that looked disturbed, like it had been dug into and packed back down at some point, long enough ago that grass-colored mold had grown over the surface, but recently enough that the edges were still slightly raised. I didn't dig. I want to be very clear that I did not dig. I went back upstairs, locked the basement door for the first time since I'd moved in, and sat in my car in the driveway until the sun came up, because the inside of that house no longer felt like somewhere I could sit still. The next morning, I called Mr. Holt and told him I wanted to talk about the lease. He came out that afternoon, and for the first time, he didn't seem quite so much as tired, like a man who had been waiting for this particular phone call for a long time. We sat on the porch, and I told him everything: the footsteps, the cold spot, the missing hours, the basement. He didn't laugh, and he didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and finally said that his uncle had owned the house before him, and that his uncle's wife had disappeared from that property in the early 80s. No body was ever found. The case went cold within a year. His uncle stayed in the house another decade after that, alone, and according to family stories, he was never quite right again, talking to someone in empty rooms, insisting the house wanted company and that leaving her alone in it had been the mistake. Mr. Holt told me he'd inherited the house, fixed it up, and rented it out every few years since, and that almost nobody ever stayed past 2 months. He said this in the same flat tone you'd use to describe a leaky roof, like it was simply a known feature of the property he'd long since stopped being surprised by. I asked him, directly, if he thought something had happened to his aunt in that basement. He looked at me for a long moment and said that he had never once gone down there himself in 30 years of owning the place, and that he didn't intend to start now. Then he offered to let me out of the lease immediately, no penalty, if I packed that week. I packed that night. I didn't sleep in that house again. I want to tell you I left calmly, methodically, but the truth is, I threw what I could fit into 2 duffel bags and left most of my furniture behind, because every minute I spent under that roof after hearing what he told me felt like running out. The last thing I heard as I carried my bags to the car, just before midnight, was that same slow, deliberate footstep sound, coming from directly above the porch, pacing back and forth like it was watching me leave and wasn't pleased about it. I never went back for the rest of my things. Mr. Holt mailed me a check for the unused rent without me even asking, which told me more than any conversation could have. I looked up the house a year later out of morbid curiosity, and it was listed for rent again. The photos taken from careful angles that made it look bright and welcoming, the listing saying nothing at all about a basement, or a missing woman, or a man who talked to empty rooms for 10 years until he too was gone. I think about that disturbed patch of dirt floor more than I'd like to admit. I think about what it means that nobody, not even the man who owned the place for 30 years, ever wanted to find out what was under it. Some houses keep their quiet for a reason, and I've come to believe that the worst thing you can do is be the one who finally asks the question out loud, late at night, alone, in a house that has clearly been waiting for someone to ask it. I don't live in the country anymore. I'm back in a small apartment in the city, surrounded by traffic noise and neighbors I can hear through the walls. And for the first time in my life, I am deeply, sincerely grateful for the noise. Because in that house on Mill Creek Road, the silence was never empty. It was listening. And some nights I still wonder if it's still listening for me.